Welcome. This is the Institute for Assured Autonomy and Berman Institute of Bioethics seminar series. And I am delighted to welcome Professor Marcello Ienca. He's the inaugural professor of artificial intelligence ethics and neuroscience and the deputy director of the Center for Ethics and History of Medicine at the Medical School of the Technical University of Munich. He's also the head of the Intelligent Systems Group at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne. His research spans a broad interdisciplinary terrain, but focuses primarily on the science and ethics of intelligent systems of both biological and artificial nature. In addition, Ienca works actively in science and technology policy, serving as a commissioned expert or rapporteur for organizations such as the OECD, the Council of Europe, the UN, and the EU Parliament. Marcello Ienca is also a board member of the International Neuroethics Society and the neuroethics lead of the International Brain Initiative. Today, he'll be talking to us about navigating the Neuro-Data dilemma. Marcello, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Matthews, for the very generous introduction, and an extended thank you to the Institute of Assured Autonomy and Berman Center Institute of Bioethics for the invitation. I'm honored to give my talk as part of your quarterly series. So I'll share my screen, and please just confirm if you can see it properly.
We see your slides.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right. So yes, the topic of my presentation is a very specific entanglement at the intersection of artificial intelligence and neuroscience, namely the growing possibility of decoding information from neural data using artificial intelligence. And my talk will explore this technological possibility, try to assess the limits and capabilities of current technology, and most importantly, I will try to map and assess the ethical implications. But I want to start with two quotes, one from pop culture and one more from scholarly literature. And the pop culture one will probably sound familiar to many of you because it's taken from one of the most popular novels ever written, namely 1984 by George Orwell. And in describing the dystopian world of 1984, Orwell writes the following: always the eyes watching you and the voice enveloping you, asleep or awake, working or eating, indoors or out of doors, in the bath or in bed, no escape. Nothing was your own except a few cubic centimeters inside your skull. In other words, Orwell is describing this dystopian world of 1984 where privacy is completely eroded and Big Brother is watching every individual at any time. But there's actually an audible exception, namely the space inside our brains. So our brains, even in the most dystopian novel ever written, were considered kind of resilient to external access and interference from third parties. Here's another quote by John Bagnall-Bury, who at the beginning of last century wrote one of the most monumental books on freedom of thought. And the very incipit of this monumental book is, it is a common saying that thought is free. A man can never be prevented from thinking what he wants as long as he conceals what he thinks. So I think these two quotes have one core element in common. Namely, they both assume that information inside our brains and minds is a necessary prerequisite for both personal autonomy and freedom of thought. Personal autonomy being one of the core principles of biomedical ethics, and freedom of thought being one of the fundamental rights codified under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And therefore, given these premises, it would follow that if we want to protect personal autonomy and freedom of thought, we should exercise some degree of control over the information located inside our brains. Now, the reason why I am referring to this quite old-fashioned quotes in a talk about artificial intelligence is that in the last few decades, we are starting to develop the tools to unlock the functioning of the human brain. And these technologies are very broadly referred to as neurotechnologies. The history of neurotechnology dates back to the 1920s with the first attempts to develop electroencephalography measurements. But the real neurotechnological revolution happened much later, starting in the 1970s, when the functional magnetic resonance imaging technology was invented and enabled for the first time the real-time monitoring of electrical activity in the brain using proxy information from blood flow. And this is was the start of a process that we could refer to as the unboxing of the black box of the brain, because historically the brain was one of the most of the organs of the human body that was most resistant to external elaboration because of its complexity, but most importantly because of the difficulty of accessing functional information from it. Now, the technology that I mentioned before, functional magnetic resonance imaging, is kind of routine technology in clinical context. But what is interesting for the purpose of my talk is that in the last couple of decades, neuroimaging capabilities have been embedded not just in voluminous medical equipment like fMRI scan or MRI scan that can be used for functional imaging, but also into everyday technologies that can be utilized by individuals as a personal technology. And these technologies are commonly referred to as neural interfaces. Here, I'm using for clarity the definition that was provided by the UK Royal Society in their report I, Human, which defines neural interfaces as electronic devices that are placed on the outside or inside of the brain or other components of the central nervous system to record or stimulate activity or both. So I think this is a very semantically non-ambiguous definition that clarifies quite well the two functions of neural interfaces. They can do basically two things. They can record activity in the brain, and they can stimulate the brain either electrically or magnetically. Or they can do both. So you can also develop bimodal or bidirectional neural interfaces that both record and stimulate activity in the brain. Now, the most interesting development, in my view, from the perspective of privacy, which is the core topic of my talk, is the fact that the miniaturization of these technologies and increasing capability of embedding the coding function into devices for personalized use has led to the development of an ecosystem of so-called non-invasive and consumer-grade neural interfaces that can record electrical activity in the brain from outside the skull, therefore without requiring the implantation of invasive electrodes under the skull. The electrical activity is recorded not just by placing electrodes on the surface of the brain, for example, but actually from outside the skull. And as such, these technologies can be used by healthy subjects as well, and not just by neurological and psychiatry patients. And most interestingly, some companies like Elon Musk's Neuralink have made public announcements about the long-term goal of developing implantable neural interface for used by healthy subjects. So it seems that there is at least a small fraction of the current market that wants to move a step forward and develop technologies for consumer use that are sufficiently safe to be implanted under the skull. And on the non-invasive side, I think it's also interesting that the telecommunication and computing industry is increasingly interested in neurotechnology and in collecting data about human brain function. Last fall, Apple registered a patent involving the incorporation of electroencephalography capabilities into their next generation of AirPods. So with these trends in mind, I think we can predict, at least raise the hypothesis that the decade we're in, the 2020s, can see a similar trajectory with regard to neural interfaces as the trajectory that we have observed in the recent history of technology with the computers in the 1980s. As some people in the audience may recall, the 1980s were the decade during which computers ceased being technologies, niche technologies that were only available to research institutions and medical infrastructures or military organizations, but they became the PC, the personal computer. So technologies that can be used by everyone at home and for personalized use. Now, only time will tell if this hypothesis and if these analogies hold true, but the trend seems to be quite clear, and it's an upward trend. This is a report that UNESCO has released last year, unveiling the neurotechnology landscape, and they have observed a steady 12-fold increase of the number of neural interfaces and the size of the market in the last 2 decades. And one of the catalysts of this technological development is, and this is quite unsurprising if we look at the impact that this technology has on many other fields of human activity, artificial intelligence. In particular, AI can help us with reading from the brain and recording brain activity in 3 main ways. Data analysis, first of all. AI algorithms, especially deep learning algorithms, have proven to be very effective at identifying correlations and anomalies in neural data, especially anomalies that may not be apparent to human researchers. Second, pattern recognition. AI is very good at recognizing complex patterns in the neural data associated with specific mental states, affective states, or cognitive processes. And third, AI plays a key role in the new generation of neurofeedback applications by providing real-time analysis of brain activity. Now, all this is relevant from an ethical perspective, because if there is a lesson we have learned from risk assessment studies, that is that proliferation plus power usually means increased risk. So if we have a proliferation of technologies and the proliferation of brain-related data that are generated by these technologies, and this is coupled with increased computational power provided by AI, then we are likely to head towards a scenario of increased risk. And this risk involves 2 main ethically relevant human entitlements. One is privacy, and the other one is personal autonomy and the risk of manipulation. Now, with regard to privacy, the neuroethical literature in the last few years has focused on this notion of mental privacy to identify the subset of privacy rights concerned with information inside the brains and minds of human beings. Mental privacy can also be defined as the freedom and capacity of a person to conceal his or her mental information and to prevent non-consenting intrusion of third parties into their neurocognitive domain. Now, with regard to manipulation, which is the second risk I've mentioned, the philosophers in the audience will know that manipulation is not a new ethical philosophical challenge. The literature on manipulation is as long as the philosophical literature, dating back to ancient Greek philosophy and Plato's work on sophistry as a very first example of manipulative techniques. But what is interesting in my view is that some approaches to incorporating artificial intelligence to neural information may increase the risk of manipulation for a very structural reason. Namely, manipulation is usually considered to be a form of cognitive, affective, and behavioral influence or control that involves a certain set of characteristics, such as being deceitful and non-transparent, so being a covert form of influence. It typically leads to an asymmetry of outcomes where the manipulator is usually better off at the end of the manipulation, where the manipulated is worse off. It also involves the element of intentionality. And these are all components of manipulation that are quite unaffected by technological change. But one aspect of manipulation that is indeed affected by technological innovation is the element of irrational influence, namely the possibility that certain manipulative action can be designed to bypass the cognitive defenses of the individual. And from this perspective, having access to information about people's brains and minds may increase the precision and accuracy of techniques that are designed to bypass the cognitive defenses of individuals, because these techniques can be better tailored to the specific cognitive vulnerabilities of the individual. But now, with this in mind, I think we should clarify what kind of data we are talking about in this specific context, because it is a non-trivial question. So what kind of data is neuro-data? Well, to try to answer this question, we convened a group of experts a couple of years ago at Brochet Foundation by Lake Geneva. And we came up after kind of modified Delphi approach to the following definition. So neurodata and brain data were defined as quantitative data about the structure, activity, and function of the brain when it comes to brain data, and of the entire nervous system when it comes to neurodata. And this data can be of three main types. They can involve direct measures of neural structure function. This is when the data collected are direct measurements of electrical or magnetic activity in the brain. And this involves data types such as electroencephalography, which I mentioned earlier, or computed tomography, structural magnetic resonance imaging. The second category is indirect measures, when the data at stake do not measure electrical or magnetic waves per se, but proxy information, such as blood flow, as I mentioned before, in the context of functional magnetic resonance imaging. And then a third component of the Neuro-Data taxonomy we created is contextual data, such as psychographic data, speech recordings, and so on. Now, I have framed this first part of my presentation primarily from the perspective of risk assessment, but it should be emphasized that measuring activity in the brain and recording activity in the brain is necessary to develop tailored solution for people in need, especially neurological and psychiatric patients. Um, and I think it's very important to start this ethical analysis by reminding ourselves that we cannot cure what we cannot measure, and therefore we have a moral obligation towards the development of technologies that can record activity in the brain in order to better develop solutions that can reduce the global impact of neurological and psychiatric disorders. Especially keeping in mind that this global impact is extremely high. Currently, given a recent report of the Lancet Commission on on the burden of neurological disease, 1 in 3 people alive today is going to experience a neurological disorder in their lifetime. And by 2050, 1 in 2 will experience at least either a neurological or a psychiatric disorder within their lifetime. So developing technologies that can do so is extremely important from a public health perspective. At the same time, however, scholars in neuroethics and philosophy of mind have emphasized the ethical and human rights significance of the brain for 3 main reasons. The brain has been said to be not just an organ like any other, but the coordinating center of life-maintaining processes, such as respiration, blood circulation, and so on. It is also a determinant of vital function to the extent that in most world jurisdictions, the function of the brain, so brain death, is used as a determinant of discrimination between life and death. And I think most importantly for the purposes of my presentation, the brain is the main enabler of mental faculties such as memory, consciousness, language, affective states, and all those other faculties that are usually considered to be the core element of what makes us human. So according to some, what it means to be a human depends at least in part, or maybe in a large part, on brain function. There is also another reason why this data category of neural data is particularly relevant from an ethical perspective. This is what I think is probably the only unique feature of this data type, namely that it is both a source of data with propositional and semantic value and a pre-behavioral data. So data with propositional and semantic value are data that bear meanings, and these meanings are articulated in the form of a declarative sentence. We have many types of data that fit this description. For example, written text, as well as audio recordings, and signs, so sign language, for example. These are all data sources that have propositional structure and semantic value. So they carry meanings, and these meanings have the form of a declarative sentence. Pre-behavioral data are data that are that can be observed also in the absence of expressed behavior in the physical world. These include data from blood tests and genetic data. So in order to have access information about a person's genetic makeup, or there's some parameters in their blood testing, we don't need to observe their behavior. We can simply access the underlying physiology of the organism. And this makes this kind of data source harder to obfuscate or confound. So we cannot alter our genetic makeup, whereas we can alter what we write, the signs we express, and the sentences we utter. Brain data are an interesting data category because they are both pre-behavioral. So when we record electrical activity in the brain, this information can be recorded even if the person is not exhibiting any form of observable behavior. So even if we are not speaking, we are not acting, but at the same time, they bear semantic value and they have a propositional structure, which raises some additional ethical challenges that I will explain in the following. But before I do so, I want to go back to the history of this debate a little bit, because some of the people in the audience may recall that the debate about the technological possibility of accessing and decoding information in the brain is not an entirely new debate. Actually, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, the so-called mind reading debate was very hyped. A lot of cognitive neuroscientists got very excited about what functional magnetic resonance imaging could do, and some of them, like John Dylan Haynes, wrote, for example, that it has become possible, and it was writing in 2012, to read very detailed contents of a person's thoughts, including detailed visual percepts, ideas, memories, and so on. However, this a neuroscientific hype about the technological potential to decode information in the brain face two main challenges. One coming from philosophy and the other one coming from neuroscience itself. In the sphere of philosophy, Daniel Dennett, one of the most prominent living philosophers, and Marcel Kinsborn, a neurologist, observed that there is an important conceptual distinction to be drawn between vehicle and content of mental representations, and argued that what fMRI alone can do is simply to express the vehicle of mental content, but not the content itself. So in an analogy, they said, and I think that's a quite compelling analogy, that what fMRI does is more similar to a depiction of a traffic sign depicting people crossing at the zebra than the actual people crossing at the zebra. In terms of neuroscientific challenges, fMRI studies faced in the 2010s so-called replicability crisis. So a lot of studies appear to be not replicable because of a variety of reasons, including interpersonal variability, the high rate of false positives in the studies, as well as poor research designs. However, in the last 5 years, this mind reading or brain reading debate is being revisited. And I think this is due to two main facts. One is the ubiquity of brain data, as I mentioned before, as a consequence of direct-to-consumer technologies and the increasing availability of brain recording capabilities into everyday technology. And the second is the increasing capacity of artificial intelligence to decode information in the brain. So with regard to ubiquity of technology, I've already made a few examples before. But what is interesting is that it appears from an assessment that we conducted a few years ago with two colleagues, Pim Haselager and Ziki Manuel, most consumer available neural interfaces happen to share data using unprotected data sharing channels, even when they involve context-rich information. So information that can be used to draw privacy-sensitive conclusions from non-sensitive data. And since these technologies are designed for consumer use, they lack institutional oversight by an ethics committee or professional supervision by a physician. And also, they happen to have limited traceability and verifiability of the inferences they produce because of the opacity of the AI algorithms that are used for data analysis, as well as because most software used in this domain is closed source proprietary software. with regard to the increasing potential of AI for decoding mental information in the brain, I think here we're really facing a paradigm change, because for most history of cognitive neuroscience, the default experimental design was that of the so-called forward inference. Forward inference means that we manipulate a specific psychological function to identify localized effects of that manipulation on brain activity. So, for example, if I want to explore which brain region is engaged in arithmetic calculus, then I will create an experimental design where I let participants perform arithmetic calculus while their brain activity is recorded. And then when I see increased activation of a certain brain region, I can infer that that region is particularly associated or responsible for arithmetic calculus. But with AI, we can reverse engineer this process and reason backwards from the raw data sets of neuronal activation to infer the engagement of specific mental processes. And I think the pioneer in this field of research using reverse inference was the group of Jack Gallants at Berkeley, because they were the first one to develop this experimental setup where they basically presented participants with visual cues, specifically video clips, and then they trained an artificial neural network to reconstruct the visual and semantic content of that video clip just by having access to the brain recordings alone. So the algorithms had no access to the actual video clip. They only had access to the data set of brain recordings that were measured while people were watching the video clip. And what they meant, the algorithm was capable of doing was creating reproduced or reconstructed images like the one you see in the bottom left, which is not very sophisticated in some sense because you cannot identify any person from the image. But if you think about it, it's already sufficiently sophisticated to discriminate whether this is a human as opposed to a non-human animal or an object. And I think it's already sufficient to infer the sex of the human. And this is already a kind of information that can be ethically sensitive. For example, in a court proceeding, could be used to assess whether a witness has actually seen someone, a person, as versus no one on a crime scene. And they also managed to replicate the study using semantic trees, proving that not just the visual content, but also semantic content could be decoded. And 10 years later, one of Jack's postdocs in Japan, Nishimoto, used stable diffusion, which is a latest AI model for decoding purpose. And as you can see, the granularity and the sophistication that of the images reconstructed is incredibly higher. So the details that can be seen here are much greater than what was possible 10 years ago. This is another group of Alex Huth in Texas that used a semantic reconstruction model based on large language models, in particular based on the GPT paradigm, which will probably sound familiar to some people in the audience because that's the paradigm that ChatGPT is based on. And what their decoder did was predicting real time what the brain recordings were encoding semantically using this real-time decoder prediction. Now I'll play the video that shows how the decoder automatically adapts to the information and input in order to produce accurate description of what is being seen. So again, the model is participants are watching a video clip, this particular video clip that you see here, and then the decoder is decoding the semantic content from the brain data alone without having access to the video clip. And the study was published in 2023 and conducted in 2022. At that time, only the first GPT paradigm was available. Now in 2024, we have the GPT-4 paradigm available, which is the one that currently powers ChatGPT. If GPT-1 was based on 117 million parameters, the GPT-4 paradigm is based on 1.76 trillion. That's a quite big difference. If we have to quantify, if we have 10 euros bills or $10 bills, and I have 117 millions of those, I can cover the distance between Beijing and New York. But if I stuck together 1.76 trillions of banknotes, then I can cover the distance between Earth and the moon and back 609 times. So I predict that we will soon see studies that can incorporate more advanced large language model paradigms to achieve increased decoding capabilities. Of course, with the caveat that an increased number of parameter doesn't linearly correlate with increased performance. And I also want to show this other study by the group of Ed Chang in San Francisco to highlight that the potential for decoding mental information from brain activity is not just something that we should worry about from an ethical perspective, but also something that we should welcome from a clinical and research perspective. In this particular case, they use speech decoding model to allow a person with advanced ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, who became aphasic as a consequence of the disease progression, to re-interact with other humans using a brain-computer interface for speech decoding. And now I'll present you some videos that show this kind of interaction.
How's it going?
It is good to see you.
Giving them the ability to communicate again with their loved ones and caregivers is really what we're looking to do.
I was thinking about running to the store.
What time will you be home?
In about an hour.
Do not make me laugh.
That's the first time we've ever had a conversation using this system.
So this system was capable of decoding about 78 words per minute, which is a remarkably high speed. And I think this is really showing the progress that AI models are are enabling for neural interface development. So I think all the studies that I have summarized here are the reason why mind reading has become mainstream again after 20 years in the scientific community, to the point that Nature, the most important scientific journal, this year published not one, not two, but actually 3 editorials and news features on the topic of mind reading. So where do we stand in the mind reading debate? I think for a long time, the only thing that we could do with AI as applied to brain recordings was to establish statistically sensitive correlations between data aggregation and mental states, which is what we could call mind reading in a broad sense, using borrowing Noam Chomsky terminology. But now what we can do is increasingly also to decode some content, some aspects of mental content from the brain recordings itself. And this makes us face what I call the Neuro-Data dilemma, because on the one hand, we need this technology in order to enable assistive solutions for neurological and psychiatric patients. But at the same time, it's pretty obvious that the data economy is particularly interested in this asset of brain data because that can enrich the already large data sets that these companies own to predict, for example, consumer behavior. And there is also an increased risk of cognitive surveillance. And here I'm reporting a pilot study that a US-based company called BrainCo conducted in elementary schools in China, rolling out a non-invasive electroencephalography-based neural interface that would monitor concentration levels in the elementary school pupils using a kind of traffic light system that is green means paying attention, red means spacing out. And this technology was meant to be used to improve educational processes. But again, it's information that can be misused in contexts such as the use by minors, for example. So where do we stand in this Neuro-Data dilemma? I think we stand at a point where it's apparent that both a laissez-faire and a strong outright ban are undesirable because one would obliterate the benefits that this technology can produce in the clinical setting, but also the absolute deregulation will probably lead to socially and ethically undesirable consequences in the consumer setting. So what I've been suggesting, and I'll skip this distinction in the interest of time, is a multi-level governance model that is based on 4 fundamental levels of governance. One is responsible innovation by private actors. Another one is soft law. And the third one being supranational data and device regulation. And the last one being the level of fundamental rights. Now, in terms of responsible innovation by research organizations, for example, there are a lot of professional societies and international organizations that are operating in this field. The IBI, the International Brain Initiative, that brings together all the nationwide large-scale neuroscience projects in the world, is currently developing a framework for responsible collection and sharing of neural data. And at the same time, the IEEE Standards Association is, as a working group, working on practices for responsible design and development of neurotechnologies. Also, colleagues in the field of cybersecurity have been developing tools that could make neural interfaces private by design, either by utilizing, by default, privacy-preserving technologies, such as federated learning, homomorphic encryption, and secure multi-party computation, or by introducing new technologies that could operate a selective filtering of information from the brain data. And I think here I want to emphasize the work of Zizek and Bonacci at the University of Washington, who patented the first tool to decompose recorded brain signals into a collection of characteristics of the signal that can be used to extract only from the information flow only users' intended commands while filtering out any potentially private information. So that would be a tool for selective filtering, which is very important from an ethical and legal perspective because it could enable the purpose limitation in the processing of neural data. At the soft law level, the OECD has been pioneering the development of international recommendations on responsible innovation in neurotech. The recommendation was released in 2019, and it's now setting an international standard that is being ratified and implemented by most OECD member states. At the level of data protection regulation, thorny question is to understand where neural data and brain data in particular should be located in the existing international data protection framework. Prima facie, brain data are personal data, as codified, for example, in the EU GDPR. However, GDPR admits a lot of derogations. For example, it is not applicable if the data are anonymized, and this is the same for the US regulation. It also allows derogation if the data are processed for research or statistical purposes. And as I mentioned before, the principle of purpose limitation is very hard to apply to neural information because it's very hard to filter out information that is purpose specific from the flow of brain recordings. And last but not least, the GDPR is not comprehensive enough to include the protection of emotions and thoughts if these are not related to health status. So the law is pretty explicit about protecting affective and cognitive states as long as they can be used to predict health status, sexuality, or political or religious belief, but they would not cover emotion detection and subsequent profiling for consumer and behavioral purposes. And for this reason, with a colleague, a data protection expert, we have attempted to fill this gap by developing a new tool for impact assessment, which we call the Mental Data Protection Impact Assessment, which involves which posits that processing of data that can reveal mental information is considered high risk by default. And as a consequence, the data controller is obliged to describe the processing, including the logic used by the technology, perform a balancing test based on necessity and proportionality of the data processing in relation to the specific purposes, and assess the actual risk for fundamental rights and freedoms. And this operation could imply an audit of the technological components, for example, the AI components in the processing, and involve technologies for privacy enhancing design. And of course, clinical and research users can obtain a simplified mental data protection impact assessment process. Finally, at the level of fundamental rights, mental privacy has been argued to be one core subset of fundamental rights that are of particular relevance from the perspective of AI technology innovation. And it has also been included in the recent EU declaration on human-focused and rights-oriented approach to neurotechnologies. And the international sphere, the United Nations Human Rights Council has approved last year, has adopted a motion resolution on neurotechnology and human rights, which mentions mental privacy, and the resulting document will be released in September of this year. But ultimately, the challenge will be to harmonize these different levels of multi-level governance and make sure that we can adequately translate these high-level ethical principles on mental privacy into both effective legal norms and technical standards, so that every component of the multi-layered framework of governance can sustain the other layer rather than operating in silos. And I think I will stop here, and I would like to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so very much. That was wonderful. Of course, if we were all in a room together, you would be hearing thunderous applause at this point, but we are on Zoom. We already have a couple of questions teed up, so I will start with those and maybe save mine for later. So Marissa Russo says, thank you for your wonderful explanation. What can we do to include the global South in this discussion? Your picture about regulation showed the rich countries thinking about regulation.
Well, that's a very important question. So it is true that picture is probably referring to the slide on OECD, and OECD is a group of countries that are mostly located in the Northern Hemisphere, even though not all of those. So for example, Chile was also very active in the drafting of the recommendation, and other countries like Colombia also participated heavily. But it is true that we need to expand the global debate on neurotechnology governance in general and neuroprivacy in particular. I think the work of the United Nations will definitely mark a milestone towards expanding these governance frameworks, because the UN Human Rights Council encompasses more than 180 countries across the world. So it will definitely be a document that is more mindful of the various cultural perspectives. But I think we should also be mindful, and I think this is a major problem for AI in general, not just to apply to neurotech, that now we have a sort of asymmetry of outcomes between the data collection process and the rolling out of technologies that benefit from that data collection process. So we live in a world where most data are collected from the global south to train systems that are used in the north. And this is a asymmetry that needs to be overcome. I think there's a quite clear moral obligation, and this can be done in two ways: by distributing more fairly the benefit of technological innovation from a global justice perspective, but also to harmonize how data sets are compiled in order to train the data sets, in order to train the algorithms that then benefit, that are fed with those data sets.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add, I think it's the only two countries that have a neuro rights law at this point are in the global south, right? Isn't it Chile and Brazil?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah.
So it is true that we are seeing the most innovative regulatory approaches happening in South America at the moment, yes.
Yeah. Great. So now we have a question from Rolando Macis Obando. Thank you for an awesome talk. I know the talk focuses on human neuro rights, but I wonder, do you think the equivalent of neuro rights will ever extend to AI?
Well, my answer is yes, and I don't think we need to use the future tense. At least from my perspective, there is a kind of misconception that neuro rights are rights against neurotechnology, and they are concerned with neurotechnology in particular. I think rather the contrary. I think neuro rights are about protecting some fundamental human entitlements related to their brains and minds. And potential violations can already take place without any neurotechnology. So, for example, using algorithms for effective computing through face recognition. So emotion decoding through face recognition is not a neural technology, because it does not access neuronal information in any significant sense, but it can be used to infer mental information. So we have to be mindful of this. And also we have to be mindful that this neuro rights framework, or however we want to call it, because there are terminological differences, is not about, it's not just about prevention of harm, but it's also about promotion of good. So part of this discussion is also how we can promote fundamental rights, such as the right to health, through neurotechnologies, and use these technologies in order to promote these rights. And I think that the case of the ALS patient that I mentioned before is a quite clear case for utilizing this technology in order to promote the right to health, and also the rights of people with disabilities, which are extremely important in this case.
Great, thank you. Maybe I'll sneak in my question here. So you mentioned, you in Europe, you have the GDPR, the General Data Privacy law, that we do not have such a thing in the US, of course. But you mentioned that the GDPR doesn't cover anonymized data, but of course AI is constantly changing what counts as anonymized. So can you talk a little bit about that?
No, yeah, absolutely. So that's a very good question. I mentioned GDPR because it has extraterritorial impact at the moment, but most international jurisdictions on data privacy um, uh, encapsulate this derogation for anonymized data, and I think it's very reasonable that they do so because otherwise, if all data, including anonymized data, were considered personal data, that would have a major negative impact, for example, on scientific research. Most of the research we do in neuroscience is based on anonymous data sets of neural data. But at the same time, it is true that AI algorithms have proven very effective at re-identifying people from pseudonymized and even anonymized data. I actually had a slide on this. I skipped it in the interest of time, but maybe I can show it quickly. That's a study that appeared a couple of years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine that used an algorithm to re-identifying anonymous MRI research participants using the face recognition software. So they were basically exploiting the lack of demasking software in MRI dataset to re-identify people using face recognition software from their structural MRI scans. And this is just an example of many of how we can use technology for re-identification purposes.
Yeah, thank you. Jim, I think I'm going to give you the last question.
Okay. So let's see. I'm not muted. Good. I wanted to ask about a question sort of at the intersection of two of your themes. So one theme really revolves around the fact that, this general technological direction that you're talking about here, eventually ends up enabling, I assume, AI capabilities to that have insights into what humans are thinking or feeling just via sort of normal interactions, right? As the research advances. And then on the flip side, you've been talking about this fundamental tension between sort of societal good, if you will, for being able to use that information for mental health and against sort of the personal privacy and personal integrity issues. And so I wanted you to help us think about that in the context of the work environment. And I'll give you one example. In aviation, one of the principal causes of aircraft accidents is pilot suicide. So, one could argue that those pilots should be mental state should be completely available right before they take off with an aircraft full of passengers, and that's just one of many examples. How do you see sort of threading this needle of sort of looking after the interests of society as a whole? I mean, we could talk about school shooters, a lot of different things that we worry about today, while at the same time preserving the integrity of the individual citizens.
That's a very good question, and it resonates very well with what I was trying to say with regard to avoiding simple and binary solutions. Because I think anytime there is a disruptive technology, the natural tendency and I think moral intuition that most people have, it's either we ban it or we don't do anything about it. And I think that's a perfect example of why this doesn't work. We need to have an adaptive approach that is based on evidence, and it attempts to delineate the specific conditions under which use may be legitimate and those under which it may be not. And the professional context is a good one because, as you rightly said, most professions involve codes of conduct, that have some requirements to make the employees fit for duty. So for example, pilots have to do some physical tests, they have to do a vision test and so on. So cognitive screening for people that have this high responsibility could prima facie be considered legitimate. And the case you mentioned is actually not an abstract one. You know, in Germany, we had 5 years ago, I think, a major case when hypomaniac depressive pilot actually crashed an entire aircraft with everyone on board, and there were several hundreds of deaths. But at the same time, you know, we have countries like China that are already rolling out continuous cognitive monitoring of brain activity in people working, for example, as conductors of high-speed trains. They're probably and this is done for adjusting the production flow according to this levels. But one last word I want to say about this is I'm not opposing a priori the possibility that using this technology in the label setting can be possible, but I think it has to be based on strong evidence. And today, a lot of these direct-to-consumer devices to assess, for example, concentration levels have very questionable scientific evidence. And so, you know, discriminating people based on poor evidence doesn't sound to be a good idea to me.
Well, thank you very much. Wonderful talk.
Thank you for your question. Deborah, I think you're muted.
Didn't we just talk about that? 4 years and still can't unmute. Thank you, Professor Ienca, so very much for your talk. And thank you all for attending and for your questions. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you again. Take care. Bye, everyone.